And now to the reason that we are all here, Dr. Stephen Krashen and his address, Beyond the Input Hypothesis. It is a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce a longtime friend and a colleague I have admired for many years. Stephen Krashen is the author of more than 130 articles and books in the fields of neurolinguistics, second language acquisition, literacy, and bilingual education. Among his many awards would be that he was a winner of the 1982 Mildenberger Award for his book, which has become a landmark in the field, Second Language Acquisition and Second Language Learning. He was also a co-winner of the Pimsleur Award given by the American Council of Foreign Language Teachers for the best published article in 1985. His most recent books include Fundamentals of Language Education and the Power of Reading. Dr. Krashen is a very versatile man. He holds a black belt in Taekwondo, and he has other awards that extend beyond our field. One that he is very proud of is that he was a winner of the 1978 Venice Beach Open Incline Press Championship. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Krashen.
I usually work with a handout. I didn't bring one today. So instead, those of you who are dependent on handouts and outlines, as I am, I'm going to give you the outline before I start. So if you want to write all this down, it'll be according to Warner's handbook. It'll be very easy to follow. Roman numeral 1, I'm going to review the input hypothesis. Roman numeral 2, I'm going to talk about rival hypotheses. Then Roman numeral 3 will go beyond the input hypothesis, and I'll talk about some applications, some problems in application, and a brief preview of my talk next week at Georgetown. And I'll do all this in, an hour and a half? Is that what I have? 2 hours? 45 minutes. Okay. All right. An hour and 15 minutes. That's wonderful. Okay. The input hypothesis, which has gotten around a little bit by now, is the idea that we acquire language in one way, and that's by understanding messages. And the arguments for it are of one basic kind. More comprehensible input gives you more language acquisition. And it's also the case that more comprehensible input gives you more literacy development. And what I'm going to do the first part of the talk is review some of the evidence for both second language acquisition and literacy, and we'll see that they're quite parallel, which is a very gratifying conclusion. And it's all going to be of the same kind. We're going to look at evidence outside the classroom in the informal environment and evidence in the classroom, beginning level and intermediate level. All right, let's first look at second language acquisition. Is it true that the more input you get outside of class, the more you acquire? I think it is. And the research there that we've reviewed looks at how long people have been in countries where the language is spoken. And the claim is that the longer you're there, if you're getting comprehensible input, the better off you are. In fact, I've suggested in some of the papers that, since I love mathematics, I hope you do, there's a real juicy curve that captures it. It's called an S-curve, and it's used quite a bit in science. And it shows that in the beginning there's very little progress, then at intermediate levels it accelerates, and then at higher levels it kind of flattens out. So put yourself in the situation of someone going to another country, you don't know the language at all, and you don't have a classroom. So in the beginning the input is not very comprehensible, and you're crawling along the bottom. Then as the input gets more comprehensible, your progress accelerates, but after a while you're no longer getting input with new material in it, and it begins to flatten out. Well, that evidence is interesting. It's not confirming evidence because there are other explanations. The rest of the evidence, though, I think narrows things down. Let's talk about the classroom. At the beginning level, we have methods that provide students with lots of comprehensible input, and my interpretation of the literature is that when tests are used that are communicative, these methods always win method comparison studies. When the tests are old-fashioned grammar tests, students in these methods are just as good and sometimes a little better. These are methods such as total physical response and natural approach. Now, there have been some criticisms of these kinds of results. some objections. Some people say that students in natural approach classes, for example, aren't very accurate when they speak. Well, I talked to Tracy Terrell about this, and he explained to me what was going on. He said it's true. It's actually true. If you go to a high school, and there's a natural approach French class in one room, and there's a traditional French class in another room, and you listen to the natural approach students, they really sound terrible. They make lots of mistakes. And if you listen to the students in the traditional class, they're very, very accurate, much more accurate. The reason for this, though, is clear. The natural approach students are talking. The students in the traditional class can't talk. If they could, they would sound a lot worse. And the proof is that when we give these people grammar tests, students in these classes do just as well, if not better. Another criticism that I've heard of this comes again from the foreign language profession, and that is that because of these methods, we now have a decline in standards. Students who get to higher levels, intermediate levels, aren't nearly as accurate as students used to be. Well, Steve Sternfeld looked into this at the University of Utah, and he found that this was absolutely true. In the German department, for example, the professors were complaining in third-year German that the students weren't accurate anymore. And Steve investigated and found out it was absolutely true, no question. But there was a good reason for it. Students in beginning German were now continuing to intermediate German. Previously, they hadn't done it. Previously, the only people who took third-year German were those who had studied it abroad or whose last names were Wagner or Schmidt. So in this case, an apparent decline of standards really means we're doing very, very well. At the intermediate level, in second language acquisition, intermediate level for me is sheltered subject matter teaching, and these are classes in which second language acquirers are grouped for comprehensible instruction in subject matter, and they're tested on subject matter, or the projects on subject matter. And my reading of the research here is that students in these classes acquire about as much language as students in traditional classes, and very often more, and they learn an impressive amount of subject matter at the same time. Now, we can make parallel arguments for literacy. Once again, in the informal environment, the more people say they read, the better off they are. My last talk here in 1984, I'm sure you were all here for it, so I won't review all the evidence, in New York. I went through the research on that, and I'll just update you with studies that show this. A very cute study was done by Wes Stanovich and Mitchell. It's in the Reading Research Quarterly. It's called the Airport Study. They looked at people in airports to see if they were reading, people waiting for airplanes. They defined someone as a reader if the person was seen reading a book for 10 minutes. They then went up to the people and said, "Excuse me, I'm a scientist, I'm going to take this test." They gave them a quick 8-minute test, which asked them author recognition and vocabulary and cultural literacy. And they found very strong intercorrelations. People who were reading had better vocabularies and more cultural literacy. Again, you can criticize these studies. You can say, well, maybe people who are reading more are doing other things as well. Maybe they're writing more. Maybe they're studying harder. Maybe they're all hooked on phonics. Who knows? Case histories, though, and other kinds of evidence make this unlikely. There are cases of people who developed high levels of literacy without formal instruction, without hooked on phonics, etc. Let me tell you about a couple of cases you might already been familiar with. Some of you know the work of Richard Wright. One of his best-known books is an autobiography called Black Boy, how he grew up in the South. And he said he grew up in an environment where reading and writing was actually discouraged by members of his family. He got interested in reading at an early age. When a boarder lived at his home, a school teacher, she read him stories. When the family found out, they asked her to leave. He finally got access to books by borrowing a library card from a white associate and was able to take books out of a segregated library. In agreement with this hypothesis, Wright gives reading the credit. "I wanted to write and did not even know the English language. I bought English grammars and found them dull. I felt I was getting a better sense of the language from novels than from grammars." Now, Richard Wright did it to a large extent on fiction. Malcolm X did it on nonfiction. If you read the autobiography, you know that he had early success in school. He was president of his 7th grade class. But then the family moved east, and he said his life in the streets erased everything he had ever learned in school. He describes his literacy level in school as, in prison in his early 20s as very, very low. The change, he said, came in prison. Many who hear me today, somewhere in person or on television, or those who read something I've said, will think I went to school far beyond the 8th grade. This impression is due entirely to my prison studies. The prison studies consisted largely of reading. In every free moment I had, if I wasn't reading in the library, I was reading on my bunk. You couldn't have gotten me out of books with a wedge. Just like Richard Wright, Malcolm X gives reading the credit. Not long ago, an English writer telephoned me from London asking questions. One was, "What's your alma mater?" I told him, "Books." Now, I wouldn't claim that this is hard scientific evidence, but it's very difficult for me to imagine where else this literacy development could have come from. Also, a recent study from one of my students, I think, confirms that it is reading that does it. This is a student named Kyung-Suk Cho who's just finished her dissertation, and we've co-authored an article on the material I'm about to tell you about in the Journal of Reading. Her work, I helped her, I get the credit, that's my job, that's how it works. Okay.